So we are good. So welcome to our first discussion on texturing. We're going to break this up into 4 parts actually. Today's going to be basic Photoshop, what basic textures will probably be used and which ones we consider the most essential. After break, we're going to work in Photoshop a little bit, creating some simple, repeatable textures out of a brick wall. We're going to make a diffuse map out of it, and a bump map / displacement, which we'll get to later on. So today we're just going to kind of break the ice with it. Next lecture, we're going to continue on with a little more advanced Photoshop, a little more advanced seamless texture making. And then we're going to get into some additional maps.
Do we have to use Substance Painter today?
No, Substance Painter is Lecture 9.
Okay.
So Photoshop to kind of break the ice for a couple lectures, and then Substance Painter. Because if you know Photoshop, Substance Painter is built to mimic it quite a bit. It's got layers, it's got blend modes, it's got opacity, it's got visibility, just like Photoshop. The only difference is that all of the output out of Painter are usually in maps. Whereas Photoshop could be anything. It could be a full color or high resolution image that you're retouching for a magazine or a website or for film. And it could be you're making your own maps, which is what we're going to do. So one thing you will find is making maps is a little more labor intensive in Photoshop versus Painter. Painter is designed so that you paint one map and you can make multiple maps simultaneously. Unfortunately, Photoshop is not able to do that, but then Photoshop was never designed to do that. Photoshop was always an image editing tool. The power of that image editing tool allows us to make textures in it, but as far as real texture creation, quickly, efficiently, Painter is the way to go. So if you haven't done so, download the Lecture7 new PowerPoint. That'll be the second half of the lecture. Also, the Lesson 7 Photoshop files. That contains the files necessary for this lecture in Photoshop and the next one. And then we've got a couple of files you can download also, which we'll talk about when we get to them. So, office hours, Discord hours are going to be, well, yesterday is Wednesday, but Friday. Don't forget there's also an optional go to training meeting on Friday. Frank runs from 1 to 5. I'll be in Discord from 10 to 4. Plus physical office hours 10 to 12, 2 to 4. And here's your schedule for the rest of the month. So Saturday, room 121, 1 p.m. lecture. Tuesday, room 121. This is all in 3F. But lecture time, 5 p.m., lab time, 9 p.m. Yay. Thursday, same thing, late lecture, late lab. But then Saturday, for whatever reason, we are back to a normal schedule. 1 p.m. lecture, 5 p.m. lab.
It's because come Saturday we'll have a 2-day break, I believe, before the next class, so they can't screw up our sleep schedules.
Yeah, not too bad. Actually, the only reason that we're late this Saturday, or no, wait, not this Saturday. The reason we're displaced from here this Saturday is because of Orlando IX. They usually use this whole building to run workshops and stuff.
Speaking of,
it's a good thing, yeah.
For those of us who have registered for Orlando IX on Saturday, will we be allowed in this class to attend?
Depends on what time.
I believe it's from 6 to 9 on Saturday.
6 to 9. I'll find out. Generally, the trouble is we have to verify your attendance. So if you go, unless they have a sign-up sheet or they've got something set up, we got no way to verify it. Legally, we are responsible for you during those hours. So, do me a favor, send me an email about it, and I'll find out to see if we can give you guys
That's a problem.
a chance to get out. What's that?
Can you CC, like, possibly like all the people that are in the class too?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to make an announcement. If he reminds me to send it out, I'll let you guys know.
Okay.
All right, so I'll find out to see if what we can do for attendance. I don't know. Don't hold your breath. Like I said, I don't know how Full Sail's involvement in Orlando IX, how deep it goes. Whether they're going to be monitoring it, whether they're going to have sign-in sheets, whether there's even a way to do that. Because there's a lot of open stuff that you can just wander around on. There are scheduled events, but I'm not sure that they are monitored. All right, so as I mentioned, basic Photoshop tools, basic maps. Basic maps for us are diffuse maps, spec maps, roughness maps, and bump maps. Remember, in software rendering, we don't use normal maps, we use bump maps. Real time, you use normal maps. We're going to get into one part of file mapping. And then after break, like I said, we're going to be in Photoshop for the most part doing seamless textures. Anybody here ever make seamless textures before?
How could you describe seamless texture?
Well, it's a texture that is designed to be repeated without a visible seam in it.
It's tiny.
Tileable, yes. That's another word for it. Correct. Seamless, tileable, yes. So, be interesting to see. So it looks like only one person so far. So we'll see how this works out. You don't have to have experience doing it because there are many different approaches to making something tileable or seamless. All right, any questions before we start? Now, today starts Project 6. Woohoo! Yeah, there you go. All right, so Project 6, you are going to choose one of the two scenes you've been putting materials on. Either inside, outside, day, or night. Your choice. But one environment. Everybody got it? One single environment. Not doing two, just one. So these are examples of how far you can take it. And you guys will have creative freedom just like you did with materials. So as long as you have reference, you can pretty much do whatever you need. Yeah.
For the arena, when we just put the materials on, I was specifically looking for stuff or like chairs that didn't have any, textures on it. For this one, we have to look for a different set of references for like if we want wall patterns or anything like that.
If you want a wall pattern, yes.
Okay.
If you want a wooden table or a wooden chair, yes, you need to have reference that's of the type you want to do. And you are allowed to change up. So if you decide, the reference that I had for the materials, I wasn't really in love with it, but it was something that I could do. It made sense because it was a good representation of the material type. You can change that up. If you want to get all new reference, you can, if you want to. It's a little less work if you don't scrap everything and start from scratch. But you do have the freedom to do that. So, one environment. Now, what I recommend is take your Project 5, the whole folder, duplicate it, rename it, This way you've got the whole folder structure plus all your source images, should you decide to use any. Also your reference should go along with it. Scrap what you don't want, and then add on what you do want. But at least you've got a starting point. Always keep a backup of the original. Don't work on Project 4. Forget to rename it and just keep it Project 4 the whole time. I guarantee you Maya will find out and it will correct the problem.
Yeah.
It will. Because it's Maya. It feeds off your pain and your tears. That's what provides all Maya with the show. All right. So there's a couple things that we're going to be doing with textures that are a little bit different. We'll get into Photoshop tools in a second. Let's talk about simple maps and what information they contain. So here we've got the first map that we consider the primary is going to be a diffuse map. And how do you know if you need a map to define the diffuse? Because the diffuse is the base. Well, if it has more than one color, you've heard Frank say this in line, more than one color. If there's any kind of visual detail, if there's a pattern like shirts or wood for the table, we have a distinct pattern on the floor too for the carpet. We have a distinct pattern in the ceiling. If you look close enough, you can see there's a little pattern inside each of the tiles. If you have more than one color and you have visual surface detail, you need to plug a map into. It goes into diffuse color. Make no mistake, diffuse color, unless it's metal or glass. If it's metal, where does color go? No, metal. Edge color, yes. Now, for glass, where does it go? Yes, you got it. Refraction color. But everything else is defined by the diffuse. And the only reason we don't do it for glass or metal is because it's all about reflectivity or refraction.
So what if the glass has a label on it? Would that be a different mesh, or do you do that with the glass?
You're going to find that out. Well, maybe you won't. Because depending on the scene you do, the wine bottle outside actually has geometry that's hidden for a label. And it's basically just a big cylinder that's wrapped around. What we do is we find a label and we use a special process called a presence mask, which basically removes all the unwanted portions of the geometry and just keeps the shape that you've defined with an alpha channel. We'll get into that next lecture. But since we're doing that, that is separate geometry. So therefore, a separate material. Just like a real wine bottle. Your label, unless it's etched or embossed into the glass itself, is always going to be glued on. So that's kind of how we treat it. Yeah. All right, so does this make sense for the diffuse map?
Yeah.
Questions about that? Anything not clear? So the door. Do we need a diffuse map for the door itself? Because of the door? That door. Right. So it's got a pattern on it. It's got a wood pattern, it's more than one color. Yes. How about the escape door over there?
This distance now.
All right, from that distance, fair enough. You can't see. When you get up to it close, it's painted, albeit very dirty because of fingerprints and whatever else is going on. All right, good, good, good. Table top,
Yes.
like the door, yep. It may be the two colors in that faux wood pattern might be really close together, but they're still distinct, more than one color.
What about like the plastic that this has like a weird pointy texture, so wouldn't need the diffuse color because you can't see different colors.
You would not need diffuse,
But
right?
it wouldn't have the texture, right? 'Cause it does-
Well, texture is different.
You know?
Texture is the stuff that you feel when you're looking at it. You feel it, it feels bumpy, it feels rough, it feels smooth. We define that with a different map.
Oh, it's
Not
not this one.
this one. This one is just the base. There is no reflectivity in here. This is just pure base material. No reflectivity, no specularity, no refraction, no transmission. Okay, so a couple of things are going to happen when we start adding in maps. And this goes for the diffuse map only. Because the diffuse map is responsible for primary visibility, primary color, what happens is if you do not linearize your texture, remember we turned on linearized colors when you did lighting. You guys remember that in the render set? And that made the light behave and fall off the way it should. Well, by default, the file node that we use to plug maps in with is not linearized because it is a Maya node. Maya nodes don't really know what they're doing, anything outside of Maya. So what happens is you get a texture, a pattern. You can barely see it here, but there is a floor pattern here, and it gets blown out. So in order to make it look correct and to fall in line with the rest of the lighting information, we need it to look like this. So huge difference. So what we have to do, it's a two-part process. Step one, you select the file node that you've got the diffuse map in. You can do that either in the hypershade or you can do it in the attribute editor if you can find it. And we go into, now it's got to be in the attribute editor because we need to go up to the attributes menu in the attribute editor. So attribute menu, down to render man, and over to add texture control. You're basically adding a render man node or a render man control onto the lowly Maya file node. That will allow us to linearize the color. So once we've added this texture control, down at the bottom of the file attributes, there is now a brand new render man attribute or sub-attribute. You expand it and you turn on linearize sRGB. Little s, capital R, capital G, capital B. Yes?
It's create a render man what?
It's called a render man texture control. So, when you're up in the attribute editor, you go down to render man, and there's another little contextual menu, and it's right at the top.
All right.
Add texture control. That creates a sub-attribute in your file node that has RenderMan. It's got a bunch of stuff in there, but the only thing we care about is linearize sRGB. Turn that on. You re-render, and your scene will display the texture accurately. Question? You will need to do this for every diffuse file node that you use. Because if not, your color is either going to be blown out or oversaturated or just not visible at all because everything's too bright. bright, information's too bright. But every diffuse map that you plug in. So when you do that, then you get accurate color. Like I said, this is what you're going to get initially. Then that's what you're going to get after you've added the RenderMan texture control. Interior, exterior, day or night, it doesn't matter. Because we use linearized colors when we lit, we need to use linearized sRGB when we add texture. You will drive yourself crazy if you don't use this.
Basically, if we don't use it, then just don't even try adding texture.
Well, if you are using a solid color, it's already linearized because that's what the linearized colors does in the render setting. It's good for solids. But when you add a file node into the attribute for color, that's when you need it. So anytime you've got a map, basically. Yeah. But if you've got solid walls, like you're using green, like we have walls here, you shouldn't need it. All right, so I lump these two maps together because they're more or less related to each other. That's a spec map and that's a roughness map. A spec map controls the amount of reflectivity, how reflective something is. That's under primary specular. Does anybody remember what's the control in primary specular that we use to adjust how reflective something is? What is it? Face color. Remember, in primary specular, one of the first settings, you've got face color, you got edge color, and you have the Fresnel exponent, which blends those two together. It's the face color that adjusts how bright or how reflective something is. We use spec maps as a way to control how reflective something is. And we also use maps to control how rough a surface appears. Roughness maps get plugged into primary specular roughness. In artistic or physical, even though I don't have it up there, they're still the same. So how do you know if you need a map? Well, if you've got a surface, and I like to use the back of my shameful phone, the normal reflectivity is fairly smooth around there. But you can see wear and tear, age, it's got the scratches in it. And in some areas it's scratched so much that the reflectivity is almost non-existent. It's directly related to the amount of roughness also. It's very rough, so therefore not that reflective. So if you have a single surface like this, you apply maps to control which part is shiny, which part is rough, which part is rough and low reflectivity. Does that make sense? So we define that. Now, you can do this in Painter, or you can do it in Photoshop. Now, here's the thing though. Can we use the same map to control both parts? So first off, let's identify in face color. That's the amount of reflectivity. Black equals what?
No.
None. White equals, yeah, it's full reflectivity. All right, how about roughness? What does black equal?
Smooth. Or very rough.
Smooth. Smooth, no, white equals, or black equals smooth,
Okay.
because roughness is off.
Oh, that's right.
And you turn roughness up, it makes it rougher, coarse.
So then, that means that if I want my scratches to be rough, my roughness, I can just grab my scratches map and then just like invert it and then use it for my roughness map.
Correct.
It's just exactly the same.
Yes, except it's flipped. Yeah. Yes, you just have to remember that. Most people are surprised when they try and plug the same map into both because you get opposite results.
And then you get shiny scratches.
Yeah, shiny scratches, which does not compute, at least on this point.
Well, I mean, if you have some like an injury and then you have some like in the flesh when somebody gets scratched, the blood that comes out is like shiny red.
Yeah, but we're not talking about blood.
Yeah, I know. Hang on. I was just saying.
My cell phone, if it could bleed, it would be dead.
Yes.
All of ours are dead.
Yeah.
Well, that could also be a material that's like, you know, very old and it's very rough on the outside and rusted, but then if you scratch it, you reveal the inside and it's a little shiny.
Right, except part of that problem is those scratches have to be deep enough. You also need another map to define depth
Oh, okay.
in there.
Never mind.
No, you're on the right track. It's just that you have to think what physically is going on, and then how do I do that in Maya and Renderman. So, these are black and white maps. They are expecting black and white information. That's why it's set for 0 to 1. Even though we could put color in there, in the end, only 0 to 1, black or white, is going to be registered. Value or brightness information. Yeah.
What would happen if I were to put color in it? Maya would just.
It would ignore it.
It would
If it's a
ignore
roughness map, Maya would ignore everything except the luminance,
Right.
the brightness of it.
So Maya will automatically just turn it monochromatic. Or would it just grab the red?
It will generally try to use an alpha channel. If it can't find an alpha channel, it will just take the
Right.
value information.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. We work with alphas
Now,
and substance.
it's opposite for the face color, because if you plug color into the face color, it's going to show you color.
Right.
And that's why we save that for just metal. All right, so black and white information. For spec maps, the amount of reflectivity, black equals no reflectivity, white equals total reflectivity, to the extent you've got it set up. Roughness is the opposite. Black equals smooth, no roughness at all. White equals total roughness. It's a diffuse material, pretty much. All right, so again, primary specular, face color for spec maps. Primary specular, roughness for artistic, and also, believe it or not, physical. Okay, bump maps. Bump maps are very simple maps. They are black and white also. Anything you want to look like it's embossed or etched into the surface is black. Anything you want to look like it's being raised up off of the surface, that's going to be white. So black and white maps. Now, the thing is, with a bump map, if you want no effect at all, no what we call surface relief, that would be 50% gray. 50% gray is right down the middle. In fact, most bump maps start with a 50% base fill. And then you can paint relief in it. White is going to look like it's raised up, black is going to look like it goes in. Does that make sense? Where do they get plugged into? Well, there are several places in the RenderMan material, the Pixar surface, that have bump map inputs. The one that we use controls all the inputs at once. That's called the globals bump map, which is down at the bottom of the material. All right, so start up Maya. Wait for Arnold, and there we go. Render man to kick in. All right, so I'm going to create a Pixar surface. Material. And if I go under advanced, you'll see there's bump there. Now, if you plug something into here, it will only affect the diffuse part of the material. It will not be visible in the spec or reflective part. Won't be visible if there's glass involved. Won't be visible if there's metal, which is all reflectivity. Won't be visible if there's subsurface scattering or any of those other things. All right, same thing if you are in primary specular. Go down under advanced, there's a bump input for that. That's only going to show on the spec or reflective part of the material. It's going to look like it's on the coating. So for example, everybody here, or I should ask, has anybody never seen either pottery or some kind of object that's been fired in a kiln and glazed? Ceramic, tile, china, you name it. Everybody here has seen a surface like that. Well, a lot of times in pottery or in porcelain, vases, anything that's been fired and coated, usually got a glaze on it, the glaze will usually melt on the top of the surface. Now, the pottery, the vase, whatever the object happens to be, may have roughness underneath that glaze. But then the glaze always has almost like a little runny part that looks kind of wavy if you look at it under the light. Right? That would be an example of specular bump, because it's different from the actual object. The actual object could be really smooth, but the glaze on top is a little wavy, a little bumpy. Very subtle, but it's there. It's part of the charm of ceramic fire stuff. All right, so if you've got glass and you need stuff to show up in glass, glass has its own bump down under advanced. Oh, wait a minute. Interior. Oh, wait, no. Glass we use all the way down at the bottom. All right, so globals. Glass and everything else, everything goes into, for us, we are plugging everything into the globals bump. That will affect the diffuse, the spec, glass, any parameter that we're using. Yes?
What kind of image will Maya take? Could it be a JPEG, or does it have to be a PNG or a TIFF?
As long as it's black and white and it's not a GIF, Maya doesn't care.
Okay. So it can be any.
Generally, we prefer targas because they are not as compressed as JPEG.
Yeah.
I'll get into my whole Photoshop rant about JPEGs when we get into Photoshop.
No, I
JPEGs are just the bane of existence.
oh wow. I see where we're doing JPEGs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can start on that rant right now because every time you open a JPEG file and save it, you are recompressing a compressed file. After 10 times, you've degraded it 50%. That means you have compressed a compressed file.
What about a PNG?
PNGs are compressed, not to the degree, depends on the PNG settings.
Oh, right.
There are low, medium, and high PNG settings.
Targas are just not compressed at all.
No, targas are slightly compressed, but they are mostly lossless. The best format you can use while you're working on something is PSD, because Photoshop does not compress its own files. Anything it compresses, it can uncompress in a lossless fashion.
Cool.
All right, so all of our bump maps get plugged into globals because it will affect all the parameters of our Pixar surface at once. Again, black and white maps. Now, if you want a gradient between black and white, you can do that. Just remember, at 50%, it's going to look like nothing's happening, which kind of the way it should. So black looks like it's receding, white looks like it's coming up off the surface. Simple map. Questions? All right, now, file mapping methods, how we get these maps onto our geometry. Today we're going to deal with the default, what we call texture mapping. Texture mapping is done by using the UVs on the surface. Two-directional control, which is what? What two directions? U and V.
Oh.
It was like a trick question. U and V, you're sliding it across a surface in 2 dimensions. So technically, yes, it could be X and Z or X and Y, depending on what Z up or Y up you have in your parameters. But for the most part, Maya keeps track of it in UV space. Now, whenever you map something into the geometry, first off, you're going to get a node called a file node. This is where you plug your map into. This allows that file to interface into Maya. And that file node gets plugged into surface, Pixar surface material, or Maya materials, or basically whatever renderer you're using. Now, in order to get placement information, a place 2D texture node is created as well. This keeps track of where this is in UV space. It gives you some control over it. Bottom line is, the UVs on your surface are going to control where the texture lays. This is going to take your image and lay it out according to the way your UVs are on the geometry. All right, so let's take a look at that. So I'm going to open up the hypershade, which the hypershade is that little cyan circle with a white dot in the center over there. Who here is not familiar with, did you guys use the hypershade in model creation?
We used it more in
3DF?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so by default, your hypershade is usually laid out like this. It's got a browser area across the top. It's got a create area on the left. The center contains the actual hypershade itself called the node editor. There's usually a material viewer up top or at the bottom, and then the property editor is usually at the top or at the bottom. In this case, mine is set up default, so it's at the bottom. Now, property editor behaves a lot like the attribute editor, but it does not contain any attribute menu items. So for example, notice that my Pixar surface information is here in the property editor. It's also here in the attribute editor, but I don't get the ability to use any of these menu items if I need to do anything advanced inside the material, inside a file node. It just does not allow you to do that. Now, the hypershade is rearrangeable, meaning you can take items off, make them free floating, And then in theory, and I say in theory because this is Maya and nothing works during a demo, you double click on the title bar and it will usually put itself back. In this case, it did. Now, trouble is if I remove a couple of things and then I just start double clicking, what happened? Where'd it go? Well, there it is. All right, what happened to my other window? There it is. So it gets a little tricky, a little iffy. The only window you cannot remove is the node editor right here in the middle. Now, if you remove all your windows and close them out, you can get them back one at a time in the window menu in the Hypershade. So there's your browser, there's the property editor, there's your material viewer, the create, the bin area. But guess what? There is no restore default window. The only way you can do that is if you trash your Maya prefs and restart Maya. Yay! And then you lose all your custom settings.
And you have to plug RenderMan back in. That doesn't take too long.
Yeah, it's not totally that horrible, but it is a pain. All right, so in the browser area, you have a bunch of buttons across the top. Most of the time, this on button means that it will try to update the icon in your browser of the material in real time. So if you make it color, it'll try to update it to make it whatever color it is. If you plug a texture in, it will try to update that as well, show you what it looks like. So we can order the browser to be either in icon mode, which is this, or in list view. Welcome to Windows 3.1. You can change the size of it. If you really like this, enjoy. Most of us like little icons. You can make them big, ridiculously big. You can sort them alphabetically, which is on by default. You can sort them by type. Keep all your Pixars together, all your Mayas together. All right, in the create area here, this behaves a little bit like your create render node. When you hit Shift T on a surface, brings up the create render node window, and then you go and you pick RenderMan, you go to materials, and you pick Pixar surface. Now, whenever you create a material, all your materials will show up in the browser. If you want to see what attributes are in a material, you can simply select it like I've got here. It will display the properties, editor, all the values that are in the material, also in the attribute editor. If you want to graph a material, or just be able to see what's attached to it or what it is attached to, a couple of ways you can do it. You can select it in the browser, right-click, and go to Graph Network. What that will do is drop it down into the node editor and show you what it looks like in a node-ordered fashion. You'll notice that every material also is plugged into a corresponding shading group. Shading groups keep control of everything at render time. So when you hit the render button, the renderer goes to the shading group and says, what do you have plugged into you? It says, hey, I got a Pixar surface. What's plugged into that? Well, I've got a diffuse map to define wood. I've got this number of lights are linked up to it. This piece of wood material is assigned to 5 pieces of geometry in the scene scattered all over. And the renderer goes cool and goes off and just does that for each shading group. So the shading group's job is to keep track of everything that the material is assigned to and whatever is plugged into the material as well. Now, in the node editor, it's like being, what was that movie? The one Inception, is that the one where you dream? They control your dream within a dream, and if you die in the dream, you die in the real world. This is Inception here, because if you delete the Pixar surface here, you delete it in your scene. It is gone for good. Exactly.
So if I delete this node of the picture surface, and that means that the one picture surface one,
Yes.
say I name it Jerry. If I delete the picture surface node for Jerry, it deletes it only for that picture surface, right?
Correct.
And if I make a new one, it's still gonna have it.
No. If you create a new one, you have to assign it to whatever you deleted Jerry from.
Oh.
Because when you delete Jerry, you've deleted whatever Jerry's attached to, now has no material connection.
So if I make a new picture surface, it's gonna be fine, right? Like
If you make a new one and assign it to the geometry that it was assigned to.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Theoretically, everybody will be happy.
Except for Jerry.
Yeah, well,
Jerry.
yes. Now, if you want to clear this area up, a couple ways you can do it. Well, the quickest way is at the top of the node editor, fourth button from the left, looks like a little Subaru icon. It's clear graph. That will basically clear this up, put all the nodes away where they belong, kind of like putting your shoes away, your socks away, all your toys, all your pencils, whatever you have laying around. Cleans up everything. Files them into all these nice little cubby holes up here. So you have materials. If you have a texture, it will file it in there. Utilities, rendering, lights, default lights in your scene, cameras. You get all your cameras. There's your shading groups. Bake sets. We don't have any bake sets. You get a whole bunch of stuff. Materials are on by default. Now, another way to get your material into the node editor so you can see it is to middle mouse drag and drop it into the node editor. If you do that, you do not get to see the attachment that it has to the shading group. If you want to see that attachment down here, you can use one of these three buttons across the top on the left. The button on the left will show you inputs. That's why the arrow is on the left side. It shows you all incoming connections. The button in the middle shows you incoming and outgoing connections. The one on the right shows you only outgoing connections. Most of the time, you probably want to see both, so you just click both. Now, since I don't have anything plugged into the shader, I'm not going to see anything because I don't have any inputs. Does that make sense? Questions? All right, something else that you can do in the hypershade, which they may or may not have shown you, is what happens if you've got a material that you made in one scene, but you want to use that material in another scene. So you spent a lot of time working on it. You built some kind of crazy network. You spend a lot of time. You want to be able to export that out so you can use it in another scene. We can do that in the hypershade by exporting materials. So let me put some stuff on here. So I'm going to plug in a diffuse file. And let me see what I have. Oh, good. I got lots of stuff in there. All right, so let me set my file or my project. All right, so I really don't like working in the property editor just because I don't have access to the attribute menus. And also occasionally, the property editor will truncate or cut off some of your settings in your material or whatever you happen to have graphed or selected at the time. But just know that you can attach stuff in here. So here, diffuse, next to color, I'm going to click the checker mapping button. That brings up my create render node. Now, instead of me going down here and choosing Pixar surface, I don't want that. I want to take something and plug it into my diffuse channel. Whenever you click on an input connection, which is that checker button, Maya automatically looks at what that connection is and says, okay, I'm going to select for you the objects that I know work in that attribute. So it selects automatically at the top 2D textures, 3D textures, environment textures, other textures. What's the difference? 2D textures are controlled by UV, and these are what we call procedural textures in Maya. They're built in. They don't contain any external files. But this is also where we have the file node. This allows us to take something we made in Photoshop, something we downloaded off the internet, a picture or image we can use. So I'm going to click on File. Now notice in my node editor here, I automatically have a file with the out color connected to my diffuse color. So this is what my file node looks like. I don't have anything plugged in right now, so it's totally blank or black. And then next to it on the left, there's my place 2D. This is how, whatever I plug into that diffuse color, this is how it's going to get wrapped onto the object in UV space. So you guys did enough UVing to know UV space is 0 to 1, right? Mm-hmm. So notice coverage is set at 1 to 1. The first column is U space, the second column is V. So with both coverage, U and V set to 1, it is covering the entire 0 to 1 space. It's going to fill it. Translate frame, that means it will translate it in units, in U and or in V. If you want to move it around, shuffle it. Rotate frame, it will take the entire UV frame, or actually no, not the UV frame. It will take the entire file frame and rotate it in degrees. By default, it is set to wrap itself in U and V until it covers the entire surface. That's what wrap U and wrap V means. That's checked on by default. Repeating U and V makes the texture get smaller. In order for something to repeat, it has to make itself smaller so it copies itself on the surface and keeps repeating. All right, so I'm going to plug in a simple file here. And let's just take brick wall that I've got. So I'm just going to use my little material viewer here. If it doesn't crash. There we go. So I'm going to use this as a way to just display very quickly without having to create any geometry or render something out. It's meant to give you a preview of what your material will look like in a fake environment. It's basically got a dome light wrapped around it. But this is what it's doing. It's taking my brick wall, covering the entire shape here, and I've got it set up to be a sphere. I can set it to be anything I want. There's a shader ball. There's cloth. Why would you want to have cloth look like that? I don't know, but you can. If you decide you need a brick teapot for whatever reason, there you go. Ocean, yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. Glass splash is always fun, or glass fill, I should say. There we go. Splash is always fun. There we go. Hair. That ought to be entertaining. That's a new one. Oh, good. I think I crashed Maya. Yeah.
Can't you also like rotate it and stuff so you can see if you can do it?
No, unfortunately, you can't navigate around it. It's just meant to be a just 2D view. It's supposed to be quick, because if you had the ability to navigate, it would have to redraw itself all around. Yes, it is. Yes. So consequently, it looks like the roots need to be painted because they're still bricky. All right. Yeah, so I mean, I like Sphere just because it's organic. It shows you stretching. It'll show you a bunch of stuff. All right, so if I want to adjust the placement of this, say for example, I want my bricks to be smaller. They're gigantic. So if I want them to be smaller, I repeat it in U, and I can also repeat it in V. What it's doing is, in order to make itself smaller and copy itself at the same time. So it's got to make itself smaller, and then it can copy itself. Notice that my texture right here, I've got a seam. This tells me right away my texture is not tileable or seamless, because I've copied it more than once, and now whenever you make something seamless or tileable, the top part of the texture, when you copy it, is going to line up with the bottom. The left is going to line up with the right. So that's how it just keeps copying itself until it covers the surface you want. And that's why in Photoshop we go in and we make these as non-visible as possible. I don't want to say they're not there. We kind of hide them the best way we can. If you've done a good job making something tileable, it's going to be really hard to find a seam. So, as I increase this again, make it smaller, it copies itself more across the surface, and you can start to see a pattern in the repeat. And that's another thing we try to minimize. Your eyes, you guys are pattern recognition experts. You're taught that from birth. So when you see something, your eyes will zoom right in on a repeating pattern. So if I go to 4, makes it smaller, but I can see more tiles, more repeating. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's why there's a need for a repeating texture. All right, so if I take the same texture, let me go back and fix this. Let's go back to 1, just to make it easy. So if I rotate the frame, again, it's in degrees, 90 degrees. These are blocks, basically. So if you're going to rotate it, you're probably going to rotate it in 90-degree increments. Because if you were stacking bricks, that's how you'd have to do it. All right, now, one thing that we generally don't get into too much is there's actually what's called a noise function inside each place 2D that is created, down here at the bottom. So if I take point 1, it adds some random noise into the material. Well, that's one of the ways you can do it.
Because what you do is that you could just do it on straight lines, just like do straight lines in Photoshop and add some noise to it so that it looks a little more colorful.
Yes, you could. So there's a lot of possibilities. Now, the reason I show you this is not so that you can run out and use it in your project, but just know that it's there. It's one of those things where if you use it wisely and creatively, nobody's going to know what it is. They're just going to go, oh, that's a cool pattern. But if you try to force it into your environment and it doesn't exist in your reference, we're going to find it right away. Just like anybody who's looking at it, they're going to go, what? Why does my brick wall look like Jackson Pollock made it? Yep, down here under noise U and noise V. There's no slider, so you'll have to be really sparse. Like if I go full on 1 unit,
If you control the noise, it'll only be like you
then it starts to look like an alien planet. Now this is procedurally done. It's procedurally based texturing. Maya's got built-in procedural textures, which are, how do I put this nicely? They're 25 years old. They, for what they do, if you use them wisely, they're not bad. But if you try to do stuff that you've seen people do in Substance Designer or Substance Painter, it's never going to reach that. Maya stopped working on these procedural textures right after they made them, which I don't know why. They could have owned the market as far as procedural texturing goes, but they chose to ignore it, and Substance said, hey, we're going to steal that. Not steal, appropriate. Now, procedural generated textures go all the way back to fractals and fractal technology and the ability to have a computer mimic a fractal or a branch of a branch of a branch of a branch. It's like a snowflake. You know, you zoom in on a snowflake and, you know, little pieces of itself look the same if you could zoom in far enough. Just things that recur in nature, it tries to mimic through math, basically. And just, for whatever reason, they decided, oh, this is good. We're just going to make some basic, simple ones, and then we're done. But there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with them. All right, but I just wanted to show you how the Place 2D texture controls the texture itself on a surface. Does that make sense? So UV space is how it's controlled. Most of the control you're going to wind up doing is going to be in the repeat U and repeat V, making it copy itself to get the right scale. We'll get into a couple other things too. Coverage, you generally want it to cover the entire surface. Translating it, well, you can shift it around in 0 to 1 space. If you lay your UVs out right, you're probably not going to have much in the way of shift at all. Right, questions? How about on the hypershade? Now the hypershade, if you want to clean this up again, you can click on the Subaru icon. If you have it graphed and you close the hypershade and reopen it again, it's still there. So if I decide to graph the Lambert 1 down in there, what it will do is automatically clean up the old stuff that's there and then pop in the new one.
Can I copy paste nodes from one section to another?
No, you would not copy paste. You would right click and assign a material to an object. If you want to take, say for example, here. Suppose I wanted to take my file node and plug it into the Lambert. For why I would want to do that, I have no idea. In fact, that's a bad idea. Let's just go down and make another Pixar surface. There we go. So I have it selected, so that's what's going to show up on my material editor. Well, it's going to keep, as I create stuff, it's going to keep dropping it down into the node area until I clean it up. It's, in other words, it's like having a little sister or brother. They're messy. They're not going to clean up after themselves. You're going to step on their Legos and bleed at night. So what you usually need to do is clean up the area. So I can clean up the node editor here, and then I can graph whatever I want in here. So give me an example.
So for example, let's say you drop those two together and you want to combine those two for whatever reason. Would that be possible?
Well, I don't want to attach two materials to each other, but I can have them share the same file. So for example, if I click on those two, now, here's the trick. If you want to get both of them down there at the same time, what you need to do is pick the one that's not down in the node editor, middle mouse drag and drop it. You can then select Pixar Surface 1, shift select Pixar Surface 2, and then graph both of them. So now I can see what both of them are. Now, say for example, I want to take my brick wall and plug it into Pixar Surface 2. I can left click on the out color, and I've got a little connection node. I can just take that and drag it into diffuse color here. So now I've got that plugged into both Pixar Surface 1 and Pixar Surface 2. So one could be a wall, one could be a table, one could be a ceiling. I mean, you don't usually have brick ceilings, but whatever. Does that make sense? Questions? All right, now. So right now I don't have any geometry in my scene, so I'm just going to create a simple polyplane, scale it up, create a polysphere, pull it up out of the ground in Y, 1 unit. And what I want to do is, let's assign a new Pixar surface to the ground plane, because I don't necessarily want to have brick on both of them. There we go. So Pixar surface here, if I want to get one of the materials I've already made, if I know what the name is, I can right click and assign existing material. But if I can't remember which one was the brick wall, 1, 2, or 3, or was it 1 and 2, or 1 and 3, and 2 or 3? Yeah, so that's why you name them, right? But I didn't. So I'm going to go into the hypershade, and what I can do is figure out, do I want Pixar Surface 1 or 2? So if I say 2, all I have to do is select the surface, in the hypershade, right click on top of Pixar Surface 2, and then assign material to selection. Now, if I want to see the material in the viewport, press 6. Very good. There you are. It's the brick Death Star. It's a brick Death Star. But It's got seams. I know that. This is just a demo. All right, so let's see. I know what. I'm going to create a dome light. Going to use the default dome light of white. And let's render this out and see what happens. There we go. It's all bricky. Right, now, I come in and I throw a distant light on it. Why? Because I need the sun here in my environment. So I gave it some energy. Right, so here's a pretty good example of my texture blowing out. Right up here. Part of that is going to be caused by the intensity of the light. Another part is going to be caused by linearizing colors. So what I want to do is, let me go into the the render settings, go to advanced, turn on linearized colors. And let's just re-render this and see what we get. Notice that now the scene is responding a little more accurately to the light level, but my sphere is just as bright. Notice that linearize did not save my sphere from getting too blown out. Right? The reason I'm going over this is because this is where we would use the create or add RenderMan texture control to linearize the color in the file. Because right now this is getting blown out. Right, to do that, we go into the hypershade and I assigned Pixar Surface 2 to this, which is this one. And what I need to do is create a RenderMan control. Now, you'll notice in the property editor, I do not have any menus. So I need to go into the actual attribute editor. I go to Attributes, RenderMan, Add Texture Control. Let me stop. Oh, good, I did stop it. So I added texture control. Now I go down to the bottom. Now RenderMan is down here. Expand it, turn on linearize colors, re-render, and now my sphere looks the same. Huh. Stop that. Well, this is what it should look like. So why it is not working in the render, let me see. Yeah, the trouble is I'm going to lose this one, but yeah, that's probably what it is. So let's take that off. Turn that on. Ah, there we go. So now turn on linearized colors. Re-render. There we go. No, it wasn't. It was just not displaying in IPR because it was stuck in the memory somewhere. So without linearized sRGB, this is what your file textures are going to look like. When you turn on linearize in the file node, this is what it's going to do. So you've all lit your scenes with linearized colors. So for each file, or I should say texture file node that you use for the diffuse, you need to turn on linearized sRGB. Now, only for diffuse. Spec maps, roughness maps, bump maps do not need this at all because they're only black and white. It's only the diffuse color that needs this. Does that make sense? All right, so a couple more things before we head on break. Whenever you make a file node, you're going to get a place 2D. If you choose to use one of the built-in Maya procedural 2D textures, this is what you're going to get. You guys probably have all used the checker, right? That is a procedural texture. That is computer generated, does not contain any exterior file. That also has a place to be. That's how you make the checkers bigger or smaller. Make it repeat itself to get smaller. You cut down the number of repeats to make it bigger. All right. So, 3 out of these 5 maps we've gone over. Spec maps, roughness maps, bump maps. They all contain what information or what in common do they have with each other? Black and white, right. 0 to 1. You'll find when we get into displacement maps, in lecture 10, displacement maps contain the same information. We're going to get into presence maps next lecture. Those are alpha or opacity maps. They control what is visible and what's not visible. Again, black and white. Alpha channels, black equals transparent, white equals opaque. Make sense? Any questions? What's that?
Instead of a sheer curtain, is that where that would like come into play? Or am I thinking of like
No, this is either visible or not visible. Technically, you can do it if you want to make something, if you want to fake something translucent. It's not really the preferred way to go. But theoretically, you can. I've done it. It doesn't work as well as other functions. You would either, you'd probably use translucency for that, which would be the subsurface scattering. But our curtains, we're not worried about. Our curtains are going to be solid. Big, heavy.
blackout curtain?
Yeah, well, I'll sort of black out, so. They're not gonna let light through.
So, let's think about, like the pattern on the shirt, would that be more, like, like pattern with sewing a shirt or something like that? Would
Okay,
that-
I got a pattern on my shirt, it's pretty big. He's got a plaid pattern on his flannel shirt. So that's a nice repeatable texture right there.
Okay. So let's say,
The floor would be the same thing.
okay, so, for example, like that pattern, I would put it on material and the texture would go on top of that, or I could just get away from that, just.
Well, you have to have your texture has to get plugged into a material. You can't plug a texture into a surface directly.
Right, I know that, but I'm not saying material with the cover, two colors, that could be that.
That's gonna be in your file. Remember, more than one color, your map is going to contain that information. Just like my brick wall. My brick wall had the grout color, it had the brick, the reddish brick color. All that information is contained in the file. So all patterns, all textures, like wood grain, that's all gonna be in your file. So for example, let me go back to my simple little scene here. Suppose I put a wood texture on the ground plane. So I would select it, go to Pixar 3, Pixar Surface 3, click on the checker button. I want a 2D file. I happen to know I have a wood texture in my folder all the way down at the bottom called walnut. And if I drop that in and re-render, now is the grain too big? Yeah. Did I blow it out? Yeah. So if I want this wood grain to be smaller, I can go into the Place 2D and I can try repeating it. But I'm going to get a seam. But I have no choice if the grain is too large. So if I need to have a really small wood grain look, I'm going to have to find either a really big texture or make it repeatable or tileable so I get the scale I want. Now, if you want to have it look like it's pieced together, that's fine, but you're going to have to justify it with reference. Like most of the time, if you've got a tabletop, they're going to go through great pains to make sure it doesn't look this bad. This looks like you took it out in your garage and you did it yourself. It's like, yeah, I got these non-related pieces of wood. I'm going to stain them all the same color. I'm going to slap them on. It's going to look great. Trust me. You know, it's one of those things where your parents would go, oh, that's so nice.
That sounds like you should give your wife to avoid throwing out everything in your garage.
Yeah, it's art. This is my mosaic table. Yeah, there you go. Oh, that'll make such a nice planter table. We'll put it outside. We'll cover it with dirt. It'll look great.
We'll put it outside by the curb. Hopefully the garbage men won't take it.
All right, questions? Does that make sense? All right, so it's a good time. Let's take a break. Come back at 2:55. We're going to start right in with Photoshop, so make sure you have these files downloaded.